It's fair to say that with the impending evolved jobs, almost everything is going to change for FF14's combat. At the North American Fan Fest, Square Enix showed off 4 of them, and there we got an early idea of the direction they are heading, the criteria they deem most important for the game going forward, and they quite literally outlined their goals in what they're trying to achieve by essentially reworking every job in the game. Personally, I saw flashes of a future for Final Fantasy XIV that could be incredibly exciting. They're focusing on timing, on being able to adapt the ordering of your skills to fit the requirements of whatever battle you're engaging in, and on jobs feeling well and truly unique from one another, rather than like they're just extra slots within a role. I loved that insane barred directional gap closer they added. For the first time, a movement tool that is solely based on the direction you press rather than where you're facing, and it ties into the rotation in a cool way. Dragoon is getting, in a first for the entire game, a split between the 2 flank positionals for a total of 3. Paladin is getting shield swipe back, but this time it's way cooler. It's clear that flavor and choice are the currencies Square Enix are throwing at us, but we've seen 4 jobs. What about the other 17? Today, I'm going to be theorizing what we could be getting for other healer jobs come Evercold. It's a little thought experiment and not to be taken too seriously, but I encourage you at any point to leave your own ideas and hopes in the comment section, because I'd be really interested to see them. We have this fun little window of time to throw ideas at the wall where nothing is set and anything is possible, and I want to have a good time with it. Am I going to be wrong a lot? Yes. Is that okay? Absolutely. If you want to support discussions and deep dives into FF14, please do consider subscribing. So here are the 3 rules we should be working off based on the evolved jobs that already got showcased. Firstly, we should be able to condense down the core concept of a job into a single sentence and build from that. Dragoon is the melee DPS that uses powerful jumps to change the flow of battle and break the rules. Bard is the supportive singing archer. Paladin is the front line of the party, mixing melee and magic. Secondly, their rotation needs flexibility. It's clear FF14 is moving away from having strict rotations that you need to perfectly memorize, and then instead going in favor of giving you a number of options on a loop with leeway in between them, and you need to stick the individual components in the right place based on the mechanical and defensive needs of your team. Lastly, we have to look at the PvP toolkits and rip what looks like it perfectly fits directly from them. Mr. Prime developed the PvP job kits, and some of it is peak, if we're being real. We can see that he isn't shying away from just taking the good aspects, like Dragoon, with Sky High and the reworked Whirlwind Thrust. I think that we can draw some hints from overarching changes they made to White Mage in the development panel showcase, which will inform how I make predictions in regards to healer. First, and most clearly, healing buttons have been consolidated heavily, and in more ways than you may initially expect. White Mage had 2 of its single target mitigations merged into one, namely Aqua Veil and Divine Benison, and whilst I can see some being frustrated that this denies them the option to space them out in a more free-flowing manner, I can very much see why concessions like this were made. Other examples we can anticipate seeing for mergers like this in a similar fashion are, for example, Celestial Intersection and Essential Dignity on Astro, with the consolidated button providing both a scaling heal as well as a single target shield. But more interestingly, White Mage's AoE heals were also consolidated, and some of what were considered basic actions in the past have been locked behind resources. In this case, I mean that access to regens now require the use of a Lily, which puts them for all intents and purposes on a 20-second cooldown. What happens with White Mage is they have a Cure and a Medica button, though you can modify their effects by pressing Plenary Indulgence and eating a Lily to give them both a regen on top of their standard effects. While this exact interaction may be limited to White Mage, I am fully expecting Astrologian to get limited access to Aspected Benefic and Helios in a similar manner, simply because otherwise it could throw a balancing conundrum out into the open. The really interesting question that spawns from this will be whether barrier healers gain limitations in the same manner or not. Right now it's fair to say that generally shield healers are considered more important to a raid group because they have more ability to directly impact whether you survive or die to a singular big raid-wide damage than any other player in the run, locking access to their most useful tools, shielding, behind a resource rather than simply a GCD, will as a byproduct immediately raise the difficulty floor of healing harder encounters, because it will simply be more punishing to run out of gauge. It'll be interesting to see what results from this, because I do have a sneaking suspicion they might do just that, and it'll present all of these weird scenarios where you're actively weighing up your longer cooldowns versus spending shielding resources and how you'll collaborate with your party to mitigate and make the best use of them. Healers will also naturally have less overall buttons that can be thoughtlessly applied to a problem by virtue of spell consolidation. Once again, using White Mage as an example, they lost both Assize and Asylum as OGCDs, as well as Cure 3 as a powerful niche brute-forcing GCD tool. I do think this naturally has the side effect of making healing more interesting if we act under the assumption that encounters will remain on par or more complex to heal than they are right now. With that said, the big question mark the White Mage showcase raised for me was in regards to its DPS kit. So with White Mage, the kit has been cut down massively in the development build. It has a new filler DPS combo which takes the place of Glare and is fully instant cast, and it has the new ability using the Glare 4 icon that replaced the Afflatus Misery archetype in the kit. Use a GCD heal, gain a stack, spend between 1 and 3 stacks on the Sanctity attack to deal damage back. It's very simple at its core. You are incentivized to GCD heal, and all mental load is taken away from DPS to make that even easier to do so well and without losing damage. There's no dot, no other elements to worry about, and it has now become almost completely filler in amongst your healing components. Do I like this? Well, the issue is how it plays into fight design, I think. Regardless of what people want, healers in FF14 have never purely healed. There is not a single encounter in the game that requires them to. There are always extended spaces between damage, and my complete expectation is that this won't change at all come Evercold. So, you'll be spending a decent amount of your time dealing damage, no matter how engaging or difficult healing is. As a result, that component needs to spark joy as well for the evolved mode rework to be considered a success. Does it need to be rocket science? No. Does it need to have a couple of different elements that each bear thinking about? Yes. I'm actually totally okay with filler DPS spells being instant cast on White Mage, though my first hope is that each healer feels unique in that regard and doesn't just one-for-one co-opt that style of play. I would like to see unique experiences from all 4 healers, considering that we don't have that many. What if Astro could use Lightspeed as a toggle, and when Lightspeed is off it has full casts, but when it's on instead it has instant casts for everything but reduced DPS potency? What if one healer kept the instant casts they have right now, like Sage for example, and Scholar used a mixture of instants and the PvP style channels instead, where you can move during them but with a reduced movement speed until the cast is over? Then, all 4 healers are moving around the battlefield in different ways. They feel distinct on a moment-to-moment basis. Secondly, if dots are to be removed, they will, in my opinion, need at least 2 management elements that feed into their DPS kit to think about aside from their filler. These can be cooldowns like White Mage's Sanctity system, that's fine, but they need to be multifaceted buttons that have you thinking about how best to use them, funneling risk and reward into rotations carefully. Healing still comes first, and in Evercold I can see it being more engaging than ever, but I have never seen a single decent argument the healers should only heal in FF14 that accommodates for the reality of what the game is and has been for over a decade, and its entire current content portfolio. You can't ruin everything that exists to make new content slightly different in priority. That would just be silly when you can easily achieve both. With all of that in mind, I want to talk about Astrologian first. This is a job with an amazing core fantasy that I'm convinced Square Enix are completely lost with. Every expansion it sees significant changes, and those changes leave it either completely busted and overpowered, near unusably weak, or strange and a little lost in gameplay style. I'm hoping that once and for all Evercold puts a stop to that. To me, the core of Astrologian is twofold. Firstly, the card system, which will absolutely remain in place by virtue of being tacked onto their weapon itself, and the ability they present to roll for cards that provide direct benefits to allies. Secondly, they are a de facto time mage, with access to heals that grow in strength over time and can be delayed until later, and in the past, they also had the ability to extend mitigation and buffs on their peers. I believe both are important, and that both can coexist in 8.0's version together. Cards can likely be fairly easily consolidated down into a single button, Draw, which turns into the card when you draw it, and then you use it, and it'll become Draw again. I honestly wouldn't mind if we saw cards gain their RNG aspect again if they were decoupled from party buffs too. Lord and Lady can even go on the exact same button, acting as procs after you use 2 or 3 cards. So for example, every third card will be a Lord or a Lady at random, and the 2 in between would be random cards between the 6 normal cards. I'd like to expand the effects of the standard cards though and feed them a little more into the time mage aspect. Maybe balance can be sent on an ally, and then the next heal they receive is spread to all allies at 50% effectiveness. Maybe Spear will make the user it's placed on radiate a tiny healing aura around them for a little while, so the team will want to huddle close. Lord and Lady could act as damaging components, but only as single target buffs, though they wouldn't tie directly into being flat damage ups. Lord could, for example, be placed on an ally, and that would make their continuation proc immediately a couple of times, directly influencing their rotation in a tangible way. Lady could make an ally's next attack deal double damage, but now it has a 1.5 second cast bar for the next use. These are just random ideas, but I like that they directly influence playstyle and are far more interesting to actually play in a moment-to-moment basis than percentage damage buffs could ever be. I would also like to see 2 PvP actions for Astro as well. Epicycle and its proc, as well as double cast. Epicycle is a gap closer that will leave a small field on the floor behind them, which Astro can then press again and teleport back to it with a proc called Retrograde. You can liken it to Ingress and Egress for Reaper, honestly, and it feeds into the same fantasy nicely. However, what if you target an ally with the proc, and then you can teleport them instead of yourself? That would be a neat way to provide a powerful and unique twist on a current movement tool. Double cast repeats the previous spell you just used. Again, a nice little job fantasy aspect that in the right hands and situation could be incredibly powerful. Astro used to have an OGCD called Time Dilation, which could be used to extend effects on an ally. This was really interesting because you could extend even consumables like potions, and it made this really good little decision on which buffs you'd want to extend and on whom. I'd like to see us get this back, or an alternate that I really love the idea of as well. What if instead of extending a buff, it could instead delay its effects until later on? So let's set up an example. You play a bowl and a celestial intersection on a friend, and then you place down an earthly star. Then you play time dilation on them, and it'll grab all of those effects. The defense buff from bowl, the single target shield from intersection, and the incoming heal from earthly star. Then, when you proc time dilation, all of those effects go off on the ally again all at once. Incredibly powerful in the right hands, and I can see it playing heavily into this delayed heal aspect that Astro already possesses. Scholar was my favourite job in the game, but I've had growing frustrations with it over time. It constantly feels like Square Enix just aren't certain what direction they want to take it in, and it instead ends up meandering, with weird changes that end up reverted 2 weeks into an expansion, a mishmash of different elements that only tentatively function alongside one another, and over time, I've simply fallen a bit out of love with it. I feel that its power as a job is what makes so many people play it despite these underlying issues, at least for the most part. There are obviously exceptions. Before I predict for Scholar, I want to recite the tale of its most interesting spell, one which acted as arguably the best example for how a single button can be multifaceted, interesting, and display risk-reward fully. So, if you've watched a lot of my videos, you've almost certainly heard this before. In Stormblood, Scholar would balance a couple of different dots with unique timers, and that, alongside filler broils, was the core of their DPS rotation. But they had an AoE skill called Miasma 2. This was instant cast, blasted a small AoE around them, and its effect was a powerful 12-second dot on the GCD. What made this interesting was that it was a damage gain even on one target, though it costed a lot of mana to use. So you have this spell that provides you movement via instant cast, slots to weave OGCDs easily, an extra boost of damage, as well as reason to be in melee range, but the risk reward of it all is the high mana cost, and if you go too far, you run dry, and then you're unable to raise or even properly shield. Whilst the risk reward it presents could easily be shifted in such a way that it doesn't directly cause the group to wipe when you go too far, I like that you have all these different elements to consider when pressing that one single button. This is interesting job design, decision making that matters. In dawntrail, with fewer buttons than ever, they need to matter and you need to think about when to press them, and it needs to be more than just, oh, buttons up, press it. It has to be deeper than that. So, first of all, I think the core of Scholar's identity can fall in two directions: fairy management and their usage of tactics and stratagems. Now, there is no chance fairies see a departure, partly because key art, promotional materials, and quests, including fairies, are plastered literally all over FF14. They are here to stay, even if they shift the more overarching pet elements away from them and make them glorified OGCDs. I'd honestly enjoy if we split the capabilities of the fairies again, making Eos, Selene, and Seraph the three distinct fairy phases, each with 2 or so unique abilities that they can access and neither of the others can. Fairy Gauge can generate passively over time, and it would be required to access the vast majority of Scholar's OGCD heals, filling the same function as Etherflow stacks and Fairy Gauge combined do right now. Seeing as buttons like Fey Blessing are almost certainly being consolidated, this is a nice way to get rid of a bunch of keys like Aetherflow, but maintain the spirit of spending Gauge for heals. In the shock of the century, I'd kind of like it if a version of Dissipation remained, but instead of doing what it does now, it would allow you to sacrifice whichever fairy is currently active, and doing so would provide access to Seraphism for the same duration as what the fairy was remaining on the field for. I mentioned earlier that I'd like to see Scholar have half casts or channels, and that as well as that they could have instant casts that could be stockpiled, much like 8.0 Dragoon can do so with Wormwind Thrust. The final and main aspect I'd like to see are tactics being condensed down into a multi-use conditional tool. I think the most interesting tactic is clearly deployment tactics, and it would be interesting for Scholar to be able to deploy more of their actions, spreading the protection to the entire party. Excock, for example, and as a conditional action it could act as a Bane that could spread dots, presuming Scholar even maintains access to one. This is a system they have for all intents and purposes in PvP, so I'd find it pretty interesting to have that growth in PvE as well. One idea I also kind of like is that of a shield that slowly increases in potency over time. So it starts off very weak, but the longer you're able to leave it on yourself or an ally without it breaking, it gets stronger and stronger, until right before it expires, it's just flat out the most powerful mitigation in the game. Of course, pairing with deployment tactics, you'd be able to spread that as well, meaning that you get this timing element to spread it at the right moment to cover damage and get as much of the shield buffs as possible. That could be pretty fun to manage, in all honesty. Sage is the healer I honestly have the least vision for, and that is in part because I find it the least interesting of the three that weren't showcased. It was clearly built as Scholar, but easier with a few quirks, And I'd like to see it further differentiate itself because with the new liths and Cardia system, it has a really interesting baseline job fantasy that could be played into even more than it is now. If Sage takes Mezotes from PvP though, its limit break that makes an immunity field from attacks by enemies not inside it, that could absolutely be insane as a core pinnacle power if it's co-opted with a new tooltip for PvE. I could see them using Eucrasia as a job gauge that replenishes over time, and then it could be used to modify actions. You know how at the moment it modifies an AoE heal into an AoE heal and shield? Well, what if you could modify more actions? Modify Heimer turns it into Panheimer. Modify your Cardia, makes it AoE for a set period. Eucrasia turns all of your basic actions into enhanced versions, and it somewhat mimics the same system White Mage has for lilies, but with far more applicable uses. I'm not sure on the details, but I would love if they lent more into Sage being the healer that heals as a byproduct of doing damage, and made that an interesting upkeep mechanic that players have to bear in mind. It could be a case that you have a handful of damage options, and the way that you deal damage influences the type of heal that would come out, for example. I'd be remiss not to cover White Mage as well, actually. Regens are limited behind the Lily gauge that enables a flatter actions now. This is good, because now you have to make a choice and commit a resource to access the core of what makes White Mage as a regen healer tick. You can't spam Medica 3 or keep full regen uptime. You instead need to make a decision and pick your moments carefully. Limitation is the crucible that allows you to make a decision and take a risk, and those are what allow you to feel good for executing well. There's also a significant peeling back on the sheer quantity of healing OGCDs the job has access to. This seems to be an intentional decision and an effort to somewhat fight back the tide of the blatant power creep in healer job kits that have over time eroded their necessity to, well, think about healing a lot of the time. With less tools, you need to use them very wisely or commit GCDs to the problem. This is a good thing. But the damage kit they showed didn't exactly convince me. To me, White Mage didn't convey any kind of removing buttons but adding choice-driven rotations from what they showcased. There is less choice than before when it comes to damage specifically. It really feels like White Mage is missing an entire job mechanic and one additional button when it comes to damage that could fix everything. What about a button that modifies based on the last heal you used? So, a cure and it becomes a ground AoE, a medica and it becomes a dot, so on and so forth, something like that. Anything that gets you thinking. I really do like that a lot of AoE mitigations have lost duration though. Temperance is 10 seconds now, Plenary is 6. Once again, timing has become a key factor in how you use your protective abilities more than ever before. Lastly, White Mage has Holy as a separate skill. This kind of flies in the face of what we see from the other 3 jobs at the showcase, where I had immediately assumed that AoE versus single target was a situational sensitive shift of the same button. It appears here they use an entirely different button for it. I wonder if that could end up making way for a shift in the rotation that could, in my eyes, fix the main gaping hole 8.0 White Mage has. Really, what this exercise has shown me more than anything is that despite me having an idea or two about 1 or 2 elements I expect them to build jobs around, and which parts they might possibly take from PvP or elsewhere and build them into job loops, really, so much is unknown. I never would have expected the Dragoon changes, for example. Not in a million years would I have predicted FF14 to pull that positional split in such a way, and it's so exciting to be shocked like that. I'm going to be wrong about a lot of this. Hell, most of it I'm going to be wrong about. And I love that. Really, I'm desperate to see and hear more, and to slowly begin to piece this new puzzle of evolved jobs together as we march onwards to Evercold.